Hello all, this is our third lecture talking about the Reformation. And in this lecture, I want to do a number of things. We're going to dig more into the political situation in the Holy Roman Empire, talk about the wars of religion in Germany. We're going to talk about how the Reformation spreads throughout Europe. We're going to talk about, I'm going to include some comments on the role of the printing press in all this. And then we're going to talk about the Counter-Reformation briefly, and I'm going to end up with a general comment about intolerance in the early modern age. So last time we ended with a question. We said there've been religious controversies before. That how and why does this one man's protest, Martin Luther's protest, result in the Reformation and the permanent sundering of Christendom in Western Europe? We, after all, had those examples of Jan Hus, Savonarola. There have been reformers before, John Wycliffe in England, we didn't talk about, and yet this one is starting in 1517, leads to the Reformation that we've been talking about for 3 lectures now. What this is really a story about how what began as an in-house theological debate took on more and more political and social elements with every passing year. I think that the explanation for why the Reformation spreads has much to do with the political situation. And so I want to make just a couple of comments about that. The political structure of the Holy Roman Empire was quite complicated. You don't need to know this flowchart, but the German princes that resided there in this fragmented political order in large part saw themselves as independent. They have more rights and autonomy than many princes in other places. This is a scenario that had been emerging since the 12th century when Frederick Barbarossa granted them extensive rights, including their leeway to appoint bishops. There was that investiture controversy back in the 12th century. And he had done that so he could just deal with Italy and his problems there. So the German princes had enjoyed these liberties for a long time. On top of that, the actual structure is different. It's not entirely set up of arrangements of vassalage, lord and vassalage, but there are also a number of towns interspersed throughout Germany, over 65 imperial towns. And they had different arrangements, but this is also a period, if you'll recall, that royalization of warfare that happens with the military revolution. As the price of fielding a war gets higher, it changes the game, and there's a lot of pressure to get more money. Many German princes, in an attempt to stay in the game so far, had been working to extend their sovereignty over town. So there's a number of struggles between princes, between towns. The emperor of the Holy Roman Empire is subject to them and doesn't have the authority that a title like emperor might normally suggest. In fact, Charles V even became emperor by paying major bribes to banking families like the Fuggers. Also, of course, to come back to this more simple map, the orange map here shows the Habsburgs. They directly control as crown lands much of the territory in Germany, but not all of it. And that previous map glosses over a much more complicated political landscape. We won't go into the details here, but the political setup of Germany is such that it adds to the complication. The papacy doesn't have the power it might have wanted. Charles V, even as emperor, doesn't have the power he might have wanted. And it was Frederick the Wise, remember, one of these electors who is part of the imperial state that chooses the emperor in this complicated political structure. Recall that he became a patron of Martin Luther and offered him protection. So there's that political context complicating the situation and maybe letting Luther escape the Pope's judgment. But then the story of Charles V is another important component. In short, Charles V, the emperor, the Habsburg emperor, is distracted. Charles V, he ruled Spain. He was the king of Spain from 1516 to 1555, the Holy Roman Emperor from 1520 to 1555-6. He, quite unusually for people holding a mass amount of power, he retired. He had had enough. And he ruled over the biggest polity in the world at that time, having vast holdings in Europe as well as branching out into the New World. And Charles V is, in a sense, in the background and at the center of all these conflicts. Maintaining his power in Spain was something that presented Charles with challenges. He had actually come from Burgundy and up that a kingdom that no longer exists. It was a loser in the early modern political competition, but he'd been from there, came down to Spain. The old guard Spanish nobles were, you know, who's this insider? He's got the dynastic ties, but he's a little kid. So he was young, but not a kid. And so he has to deal with that. He also has to deals with wars with France, and then even more consuming wars, perhaps wars against the Turks, so that ruling over the biggest empire in the world with all those New World holdings that Spain was out in front in claiming was almost an afterthought. So Charles V, Habsburg, and also Charles V becomes emperor through kind of a number of dynastic accidents that makes him the first Habsburg to rule over such a big empire. That is, we have all these Habsburg lands over here in Eastern and Central Europe, and then in Spain. The Habsburgs was a dynasty that ruled over the Holy Roman Empire from 1273 to 1918. So it is a multi-centuries long dynasty, but it's in the person of Charles I that the Habsburg, the Eastern Europe, and the Iberian rulership are both ruled by the same person. So this is a new arrangement, and as Charles retiring and even divvying up the empire in the end of his life, he thinks it doesn't work that well. So Charles is quite distracted. He was a solidly Catholic monarch. He had visions. He did have visions of reuniting Europe and the world even under one Christendom. He was the ruler of the large New World holdings, yet the Reformation, as momentous as it was only one aspect of a life that was filled with political challenges and conflicts. Most significantly, perhaps, were the Ottoman Turks under Suleiman the Magnificent, who were rivals in the Mediterranean and Eastern part of the world. Here's a map that shows their dated expansion. Two major battles in the history were the battle of Mohawks, fought in 1526, where the Ottomans were victorious, and then the siege of Vienna in 1529. The Ottomans were not victorious, but this was the Muslim Turks really not just at Europe's door, but in Europe. And if you'll also remember that the Protestant Reformation had already created rifts in Christendom, but France had already created rifts in Christendom, but France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire were still stalwartly Catholic. France, to be fair, sandwiched between Habsburg powers, doesn't like that situation at all. And on top of that, Charles V had humiliated the King of France, Francis I, when he took him prisoner at that Battle of Pavia we talked about in 1525. And so France was even willing to make a deal with the Turks against the Habsburgs. And Charles, for this humiliation, for this geopolitical threat, but Charles himself had put co-religiosity on the back burner by invading Rome in 1527 in order to punish the Pope for allying with France in this conflict. So I don't want you to get the misguided impression that co-religiosity meant allyship, because it wasn't at all the case across Europe. And so it perhaps become understandable, less shocking, when we learn that as Europe trembled at the dread Muslim Turks on it in Europe, the Catholic Francis is forging an alliance with the Turkish Sultan. Turkish fleets besieged Nice on the southern coast of France to help the French wrest it from its imperial occupiers. Francis even ordered all inhabitants of the nearby Toulon in southern France to vacate their town so he could turn it into a Muslim colony for 8 months, complete with a mosque and slave market. Thus, while England is trying to get permission to annul the 18-year-long marriage between Henry VIII and Charles V's aunt, Catherine of Aragon, Henry has an uphill battle because Charles V's armies are in Rome, and Charles doesn't want to see his aunt ditched. We'll talk about that in a minute, but this is the setting. Spain and France settle their war in 1559, but Charles will continue to fight with the Turks in a number of battles. He also has to deal with problems related to his mother's succession and some few upstarts there, to say nothing of the New World. So given that larger perspective, what those German princes are up to is just one problem among many. So what happens among Germany? Oh, here is a picture of Battle of Pavia, where Charles's army captured the King of France. And now let's take our attention to Germany. So here's a lot of words to just kind of walk through the chronology and what happened. We talked about Martin Luther. We talked about, he posted up his 1995 thesis, 1975. The Pope calls many of these theses heretical. He's excommunicated. A Diet of Worms is held, where Luther famously stands his ground, saying he will not recant. Charles V decrees him as an outlaw and a heretic to be captured, but that doesn't happen because the elector Frederick the Wise protects him, and Charles doesn't really have the power, in fact, that he has in name. The 1525 to 27 is this very bloody, with a peasants' war with a high mortality rate. In 1526, there's a meeting called a Diet of Speyer at Speyer. There's two of them. And at this the imperial diet meets, and Charles isn't there, but the German princes say, we're not going to enforce the Diet of Worms. One of its conclusions was that you have to be Catholic. And they leave it at that. In 1529, there's another Diet of Speyer. And this meeting reputes the 1526 Diet. Charles V is also absent. But this second Diet, this meeting of the German princes, they condemned Luther, but a minority of the princes wrote a dissenting report in its defense. And it's from this second meeting that they coined the movement as Protestant. Luther, hadn't been planning on making a new faith. And then when it was being referred to as sort of a reformed faith, but it's post this Diet of Speyer, that we start having this word Protestant, these princes that protested, that gives us the word Protestant, that comes to really encompass the movement and a number of different religious sects, as I'll elaborate in a little bit. And then the name Luther, the term Luther for Lutheranism, which remains a religion now, that is actually coined decades after decades after Luther's death in the 1570s. Anyway, so back to the German situation. Not all the German princes are on board. Some want to be Catholic, some want to be Protestant. It was 6 princes and 14 cities that were part of the protestation. In the next year, in 1530, we have a big meeting called the Augsburg Confession. And in response to Charles's orders to return to Catholic practice, Lutheran princes and burghers present their declaration of faith, saying, no, we're not going to be Catholic. It was a very famous meeting. Here's, I'll show you 2 different renderings of them, of all these German princes at the Augsburg Confession. So the Augsburg Confession is this famous meeting that happens in June 1530. Charles is present for this one. He calls together all the princes and all the cities of his German territories, and he wants from them unity in order to come together and raise an army to fend off the attacks of Turkish armies in Eastern Austria. Even Luther was for that. We must fight the Turks. So he called on the Lutheran nobility, swirling around, he called on the Lutheran nobility to explain their religious convictions to them, with the hope that all this controversy swirling around the challenge of the Reformation might be resolved. And it was for this meeting that a friend of Luther's, actually Philip Melanchthon, also a professor of the New Testament at Wittenberg University, he drafted up a common confession for the Lutheran lords and free territories. And the resulting document that they presented to Charles V was the Augsburg Confession. They presented this June 25th, 1530. Lutheran cities and principalities, they banded together, and they called themselves the Schmalkalden League. You don't need to know that word, the Schmalkalden League. And they raised an army and they fought the Turks. So Charles V, in retrospect, probably felt he was kind of cornered into protecting Luther. After all, he was full stop a devout Catholic, yet he needed military assistance in order to fight those Turks, and he needed it from German princes, many of whom had gone over to a reformed type of faith. Now, but it doesn't end there. In 1547, after he's dealt with the Turks, and after Luther dies, but that's not the reason, Charles wages war against the Schmalkaldic League at Muhlenberg. He personally fought there, and he temporarily restored Catholic rule, but it didn't last too long. German princes chased out those Spanish armies in 1552. They ousted Charles V, and there's more fighting. But the thing to know is that in 1555, the fighting came to an end with a Peace of Augsburg. And what they decided at the Peace of Augsburg was an important historical inflection point. The decision was the ruler's religion was to be the religion of his people, a principle that was later succinctly stated in the Latin phrase, cuius regio, eius religio. Whoever rules the realm, his religion shall prevail. So the ruler decides the religion. We are going to agree on a pluralistic Christian Europe, but recognize this is not freedom, this is not individual freedom of conscience. This is not full religious liberty. For example, the Calvinists were excluded from this peace, and such we would see more fighting. The wars of religion are not over yet. In 1555-56, Charles retires. Health problems probably had something to do with it. He had this Habsburg jaw from a lot of intermarrying among these royal dynasties that made eating difficult. He had epileptic seizures. And so he decided, I'm out. He gave Spain, the Netherlands, and Burgundy to his son, Philip II, very, very Catholic Philip, who will marry Mary of England. And he gave the Habsburg, the Holy Roman Empire lands, to his brother Ferdinand. And he goes into retirement, which he was only able to enjoy for a couple of years. All right, so far we have been focusing just on the German territories in Central Europe. What's happening in other parts of the world? Well, the Reformation, in short, the Reformation takes off. It spreads. And I'm gonna skip over talking about some of this imagery, this early Reformation imagery, kind of capturing what it was about. Here's imagery from the 100 years out. But the Reformation, it takes off in other places. It spreads. And let me say, just before I go into particular stories of what happens in which country, just generally, what do Protestants have in common? And so here, RCC stands for Roman Catholic Church versus Lutheranism. And there are a number of trappings of belief. What gets you into salvation? The Roman Catholic Church says faith and good works. You can do good things, help the poor, for example, devote yourself to the sacraments, and this can improve your chances of getting into heaven, win you God's grace. You can win God's grace with works. Protestants, Luther says no, justification by faith alone. The Bible. I'm gonna talk a lot more about the Bible, but the Catholic Church is pretty much, let us tell you about it. Protestants, read it yourself. Have a direct connection and relationship with God. The Pope is the supreme authority of the Church for Catholics, but much of the Protestant movement is about rejecting that hierarchy. The clergy answers to the Pope, whereas in many Protestant settings, the clergy is elected by the congregation, such as in Geneva, which was Calvinism. And now the sacraments. In Catholicism, the sacraments are very important. They are these rituals. There's 7 of them that a priest oversees that help intercedes to help the soul receive the grace of God and get into heaven. Protestants, very much against all the sacraments of the Catholic Church. They want Jesus is baptized, and there's the Last Supper, so they have a really hard time with what to do about baptism and the Eucharist, but otherwise they don't want all that ritual trappings. They want a more kind of somber, cerebral relationship with God. So those are some general things. What we're going to see here's a schematic version of how Christianity bifurcates and then continues to split into all these different religions. If we had, early Christianity, and we talked about how some of those councils don't totally see eye to eye, and so we have early on Nestorians and then Orthodoxy that split in 1054. We don't return from that, but otherwise Christianity had kind of gone along as one entity until the 16th century, where we're going to have these splits into Lutheranism, Anglicanism, Calvinism, Anabaptism, et cetera, et cetera. This map kind of shows you that picture and some of the relationship between them. Now I'm going to just spend a few minutes detailing a bit those splits into Protestant faiths. Before, however, I do that, I do want to say a little bit about the printing press in this role. So the printing press is invented in the 1440 or so, or sometime in 1438. A German from Mainz, Johannes Gutenberg, abandoned an idea of making his living by manufacturing medals for pilgrims or people who had gone on crusades, and or making mirror periscopes for the viewing of relics. We've talked about both of those things. And he decided that neither of those businesses were going to make it for him. And what he did was he worked on developing movable type. So convinced of the commercial potential of religion, or more precisely, the commercial potential of sin, Gutenberg turned to the mass production of paper or vellum forms, which once authorized, claimed to ease the buyer's passage through purgatory. You know what I'm talking about, indulgences. The manufacture of these bland indulgences, here's another picture of one, we've seen one before, required the replication of writing by mechanical means. And this could be done more efficiently if you had movable type. And so a lot of people are working on movable type. There's been big history of movable type, but Johannes Gutenberg, by 1438 or 1440, he comes up with a machine very much inspired by the olive wine press that creates an efficient way for replicating movable type. We have the printing press. The first one is in Mainz, Germany, and by 1470, there were printing presses in 14 European cities. By 1480, there were presses in over 110 towns in Europe. By 1600, there's over 230 printing presses in Europe. The printing presses in Mexico City by 1539. In Russia, Ivan IV has one by the 1560s until it gets taken away. That's a long story. And if you'd like to study that, take my old Russia class. We talk about it a lot then. There's a printing press in Lima, Peru by 1581, in Boston by 1638. This is a technology that takes off and changes the world in many ways. If you go to the Library of Congress, you can see one of the surviving Gutenberg Bibles on display, printed on not paper, but vellum. And so if you've probably heard that phrase, Gutenberg Bible, but something to really know here is that Gutenberg, his first turn is in printing, an early turn for him as well, is in printing a whole lot of indulgences, which are that play a role in the whole history that we've been talking about here. But the printing press in general plays a larger role in this history. Here, I just want to show you some early woodcuts of printing press in action, from the molding of the letters to setting the paper to pressing it onto the word. There's many, many steps that the people down here are setting the print onto a board. You've already heard a lot about manuscript making. Here is we could talk a lot about making things from the printing press. At any rate, here I'm going to share from you what another historian's words here. From one point of view, it is a great irony that the printing press, that its first mass productions in the mid-15th century were letters of indulgences, and that its second round of real mass production were Protestant pamphlets of the 1520s and 1530s. I talked to you earlier on about how some of Luther's texts went into the hundreds of thousands of copies being printed and distributed across German lands. Protestant authors produced perhaps as many as 10,000 different titles by 1550. So many that it has been said, no books, no Reformation. That way of seeing it, however, is only a half-truth. Without any print, the Reformation would have been different and certainly more vulnerable to its enemies, perhaps, But according to Stephen Osmond's interpretation, it still would have occurred because the culture of the 16th century remained overwhelmingly oral. Martin Luther described the age himself by saying, quote, "The ears alone are the organs of the Christian man. They were also his or her eyes." So people that could read would read announcements in towns. The town crier was a real thing, and it was one way that people who were illiterate had some access to the literate world. And also woodcuts like this one that we've looked at conveyed visually harsh criticism of the world. You didn't need to be an expert reader to see that the church here is being portrayed in a very negative way. And anyone who had been to Mass would have recognized this as the container and device to spread holy water that the priest used, for example. So that's just a little bit to think about the role of the printing press, this new communications technology, in fomenting the spread of the Reformation, and prints like this perhaps filling people's heads with fearful images. While I'm talking about printing, let me digress and say just a little bit more about the translation of scripture and Bibles in this whole story. Here's a lot of print just to remind us of some past history. The Hebrew Bible early on translated into Greek, or the Hebrew scripture is finalized in before Common Era. The Torah early on, written in Hebrew, is translated into Greek and Aramaic. So these early Jewish scriptures get translated. The New Testament may have been written first in Koine Greek, this Hellenistic. Yeah, now we're way back in the ancient world. In that Koine Greek, the four Gospels were first written in it, not a kind of more generalized Hellenistic Greek. Jerome, one of the early church fathers, he translated the Bible into Latin during his lifetime. So Christianity exists for centuries before there's a Bible written in Latin. Uphilius, a 4th century churchman, translated the New Testament into Gothic. In the 5th centuries, there were more translations into Armenian, Georgian, Coptic, Egyptian. Cyril and Methodius, who were Greek monks traveling into Slavic lands, they invent the Slavic alphabet for Slavic speakers to convert those people in their own language. Was the idea that they could reach them in their vernacular language, which is a tack that the Orthodox Church tended to follow. So one difference from the Latin and Orthodox Church. It's going to take them some centuries more to actually get the whole Bible into Latin, into an early Slavic language, but they at least get those church service books costs covered. So you can have a Mass. Bede is an English churchman. He revises he translates some of the Gospels into English, and then Alcuin at Charlemagne's court revises the Vulgate Bible as well. King Alfred the Great has some English translations done. So in that first millennia of Christendom, we see a lot of translation work. But then the church, the medieval church, discourages translation, and in 1199 Pope Innocent III, he bans translations of the Bibles. The idea being that things can get lost in translation, and the word of God was so sacred that we'll just keep it in Latin because we know that one. I'm being a little but we won't have further translations. And it's really important to get the sacred word right and to have educated priests that can explain what they need to know to the little people. But we don't really need your simple parishioner himself trying to make sense of the book of Revelations, which is a very confusing book. And so that's where things stand in the medieval ages. And then we have the Renaissance that comes along. And as you recall, the Renaissance is Christian humanism is very much a part of it. And this humanism requires going back and translating ancient texts. And for many, that was the classical pagan authors of the Greek world, but many in the religious, particularly devout humanists, were very interested in translating the church fathers, and there were also projects of translating the Bible. And so I just do want to put on your radar screen that the Cardinal Cisneros in Spain oversees a massive decade-long project to produce a polyglot Bible that has Aramaic, Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. Our Northern Renaissance shining light Erasmus publishes an annotated Latin translation from Greek. So this is all very much in that Renaissance tradition, Christian humanism, returning to old texts. And what's happening here is that there are new translations in still ancient languages. It's still very much a cerebral project. Very few people know Aramaic. What happens with the Reformation, though, is different. We start to see this move to translate the Bible into the language people know and speak in their daily lives so that they can read the Bible themselves. Luther, in a subversive act, translates the New Testament into German in 1522. He'll come out with his translation of the Old Testament 12 years later, 1534. In 1526, William Tyndale publishes the Bible in English. He was executed in 1536 as a heretic. Jacques Lefebvre publishes a Bible in French in 1530. We also have other important Protestant texts coming out. John Calvin is going to write his Institutes, which is a pillar of Protestant theology, in 1536. A little 1549, the Book of Common Prayer is published in England, which sort of spells out what will become the Anglican faith, although at that point they were more called Henrican Catholics after Henry. And then in 1560 in Geneva, a Bible is published in the English language, but that divides the chapter and verse, that divides the Bible into chapters and verse. Now we'll say Luke 3:14 is a common way to reference particular parts of the Bible. That is a 16th century innovation. And then in 1611, the King James Bible is published, which for many people is kind of to this day standard version. But this all just goes to say that the push to bring the Bible into vernaculars for people to read is very much a Reformation move, and it is indicative of this very different approach to faith and salvation, that the individual can, that scripture is all one needs to know. Remember that scripture only from scripture. Everything we need to know comes from scripture, according to Martin Luther, and that the individual could have their own personal relationship with God. They didn't need a priest from this institutional hierarchy, which Luther and many others were quite suspicious of, to mediate sacraments and rituals. And thus the Reformation spreads tremendously. Now, let's return to this Reformation taking off in other places. And I'm going to do a whirlwind of a lot of history here. Just stay tuned, and if piques your interest, come back and learn particular parts. So these Lutheranism, Calvinism, Zwingliism, Anglican, Anabaptist, these are all kind of branches from that Protestant Reformation. And Ulrich Zwingli is from Switzerland. He very much follows Luther on most counts. He's very suspicious of the church and its corruption. He preached to his people. He ends up differing on Luther on the matter of the Eucharist. He says it's just a symbol. This idea of transubstantiation, that you have this miracle occur in which bread and water is changed into the body and blood of Christ, is not something that he accepted or encouraged his followers to accept. And he dies in battle in 1531. Zwingliism is quite a growing force in the early Reformation, but it will end up being more or less absorbed into Calvinism. Now Zwingli, in his in the way he practiced, he didn't want to see religious statues there. He thought, so he thinks the Eucharist is a symbol. He purges statues out of his church. He paints the walls white. In 1527, he has an organ chopped to pieces. He doesn't want music. He doesn't think music is really the way to reach God. Unlike many other Protestant branches will embrace singing and music, not Zwingli. Erasmus, by the way, was also against, who stayed Catholic, was also against music in Mass. Zwingli did not tolerate dissent. He advocated executing Anabaptists who would not recant. Anabaptists were very much outliers. And in fact, Anabaptists, the name comes from people that believed that in order to accept a religion, you need to be conscious. So you can't baptize an infant. You need to be baptized as an adult who can appreciate what you're getting into. You need to be baptized again. But the Catholic Church, as well as many other Reformed Protestants, abhorred the idea of multiple baptisms. And everyone was willing to, it seems, persecute the Anabaptists, many strains of which were quite pacifists. The descendants of the Anabaptists are Mennonites and Amish, which do exist though their numbers are not massive. But this right here is a kind of gruesome picture from St. Lambert's Church in Munster, Germany. There at the red dot shows roughly where it is. And the Anabaptists actually took over this town for a couple years in the 1530s. And when they were forced out, the leaders of the movement were executed and put in these cages, and they were hung from the church steeple. And their bones, were picked away and remained there for centuries. The bones are no longer there, but they were removed. But the cages were there into the late 20th century. So that was just kind of one relic of the even Protestant opposition to the Protestant Anabaptists, although some Anabaptists would decry being called Protestants. John Calvin, you've all heard of Calvinism. John Calvin was a Frenchman who became he was a Frenchman who fled France in the midst of religious persecution to Geneva, where he settled and lived out his days. And he advanced to the Reformation in French-speaking ways before fleeing Paris, which was quite hostile to Lutheranism. And he converted to a reform movement. He was one of these who called it a reformed church. And he wrote many treatises. He settled in Geneva in 1536. And it's said that from 1541 until his death in 1564, he lived there and he preached in Geneva every week, with the exception of a 3-week interlude. And he was a cornerstone of what became a righteous society of bourgeois Christian citizens. Now, one of his most important texts was the Institutes of Christian Religion, and it articulates Protestant theology. Now, he very much accepted Luther's idea of justification by faith, and he took it to its logical, what he saw as its logical conclusion, meaning that everything has been predetermined by God. God is at some level timeless. And so even before you're born, God knows and has already determined if you are going to go to heaven or not. And the people that are going to go to heaven are part of the elect, and the rest are bound for hell. And in Calvin's sense, the elect were few and far between. And so and by the way, you would almost think, like, if it doesn't matter, let me just do anything. But no, it really had the opposite effect, this psychic effect that the elect really tried to, how might we know that we're the elect? Well, if we act as the elect, if we live the most righteous life. And so he was a cornerstone of this very righteous society. And Calvinism was a complete way of life. 16th century Geneva was a theocracy, and it provided a model for other people. Remember, the Puritans coming to America considered themselves a city on a hill. This was very much taken from that sort of tradition. And these Protestant Protestant communities, they would preachers of the word guided the behavior of all the citizens, and a council or consistory scrutinized any lapses. So if you misbehave, you're gonna get in trouble, you could get excommunicated and then turned over to the council and executed. It's life or death. This is the strict theocracy of Calvin's Geneva. And while directing life in Geneva, Calvin coordinated an international reform movement, which was unsurpassed in winning new converts and initiating social change. His dissent was not tolerated. And here's one example. Geneva magistrates arrested in 1533 a Spanish physician, Michael Servetus, who was passing through Geneva, didn't live there, didn't plan on staying there. He was just passing through. But he had published books criticizing Calvin, and Calvin urged his execution, and he was executed. Most of Calvin's thought is implicit in Luther, but Luther, who, remember, kind of clung to many of the ways of Catholicism. He didn't plan on making a new church. Calvin ends up kind of manifesting it all much more rigorously, and as in his doctrine of predestination, you're predetermined whether you are saved or damned. And for Calvin, it was critical, like with Zwingli, to reject all signs of popery: no special vestments, no processions, no stained glass. A Calvinist service was, quote, 4 bare walls and a sermon. Here, let me show you a picture to just kind of compare the aesthetics of these religions. Here, up above, is the St. Peter's in Catholic, and here is St. Pierre in Geneva, a Reformed church. So many icons and decoration and elaborate architecture and design versus very simple. Even the kind of the arches have borders and stuff that add something to complete bareness. There's even more bare versions. And here is another example of, on the left, we have a Catholic church, and on the right, a congregational church. 4 bare walls and a sermon. I need to tell you just a little bit about the English case. What happened in England? And here's a complicated history. Some of you already know this history. I'm just going to kind of touch through a greatest hits, but the English Reformation hits too. It is much more political in its origins, and it starts with King Henry VIII, one of the real state builders of the 16th century, who wants an heir. Henry VIII was married to Catherine of Aragon, and Catherine of Aragon was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. I've already mentioned her a little bit in this lecture. Catherine of Aragon is the daughter of Philip, Ferdinand and Isabella. She marries actually Henry's brother. He dies pretty early, but diplomatically it's a good idea. So then she marries the younger brother. You're not allowed to marry brothers in the church, so they got an annulment. Wasn't a big deal. Church could do that sort of thing. So they'd received that papal dispensation to have this marriage. Now, 18 years later, Henry made the case to Pope Clement VII that he should get an annulment because he really shouldn't have been married to his brother's wife after all. Now, by the way, when the Reformation breaks, Henry is not on board at all. He is a devout Catholic, and he even writes a treatise. He was very learned as a ruler. He writes a treatise denouncing Luther's objections. The Pope in 1527 gives Henry a title Defender of the Faith, but Henry isn't. But the Pope isn't going to grant him that annulment that he now wants so badly. And part of the reason the Pope can't is, if you'll recall, Charles V, who is Catherine of Aragon's nephew, she was his aunt. Charles V sacks Rome in 1527 to punish the Pope for allying with Spain over him. And so the Pope kind of really annul the marriage of Charles's aunt while he's got Spanish troops quartered around the Vatican. And so Henry, powerful that he may be, he can't get this annulment. Well, here's a complicated picture of the kind of family tree. Ferdinand and Isabella way back then. Here's Catherine of Aragon. Now her sister has a child who is Charles V. She's his aunt. Then her daughter down here is going to be Mary I, who's going to end up marrying Philip II of Spain, super Catholic. At any rate, so 1521, Henry VIII writes Defense of the Seven Sacrifices. The Pope calls him the defender of the faith for it. That was Pope Leo X just before he died. Then he wants an annulment, but it's not coming through. This in England is referred to for years as the king's great matter. And why does he want a divorce? He and Catherine got along well, but he wanted a male heir, and she had not, despite many pregnancies, 7 pregnancies, only 1 child has survived to adulthood. That was Mary, the future queen. So Charles V occupies Rome in 1527. Henry can't get the annulment he wants, and in 1533, finally he says, "I'm going my own way," and he declares this. He declares his England. He has the church in England declare his annulment. He marries the pregnant Anne of Boleyn. In 1533, he declares an act of succession. In 1534, an act of supremacy. With this act, Henry VIII says, "I am the head of the Church of England, not the Pope in Rome." And so this is really the break. As part of that act of supremacy, government officials need to take an oath. And Henry and Sir Thomas More, author of Utopia and a very trusted advisor to Henry VIII, searches his soul and finds he cannot disavow his kind of Catholic subordination to the Pope, and he refuses to take the oath of supremacy. He is executed for it, and he's remembered as a martyr. But in these harsh times, as when he was Lord Chancellor, he had 6 Lutherans burned at the stake for their failed belief, and imprisoned dozens more. So with Henry, we have England breaking from the Catholic Church. And at first, these people are called Henrican Catholics. There really aren't significant differences in doctrine. It's more a political move. But that said, ideas are spreading, and so many people in the upper ranks of the English court are taken by Reformed ideas. Just to kind of make it clear, yes, this Henry, it is that Henry who had 6 wives, and there's various poems that can help you remember their fates. King Henry VIII, 2 to 6 wives he was wedded, 1 survived, 1 died, 1 survived, 2 divorced, 2 beheaded. Or this one has a little bit more of a ring to it. Boleyn and Howard lost their heads. Anne of Cleves he would not bed. James Seymour gave him a son, but died before the week was done. Aragon he did divorce, which left just Catherine Parr, of course. And there's this is a link at ABBA. There is a riff, Henry, and ABBA song. If you Google it or on YouTube, you can find it and have minutes of entertainment. At any rate, I'm going to move through this fascinating history really, really quickly. And here's a slide to kind of write out the story. So Henry dies in 1547 from syphilis. His son, Edward VI, the son of his third wife, Jane Seymour, ascends to the throne in 1547. He's been raised Protestant. So under Edward, and he's stridently so, Mass goes from being spoken in Latin to being spoken in English. A new prayer book is issued. Clergy can marry. England is looking quite Protestant. But Edward gets sick and dies. And he is succeeded by Mary, who is his older half sister. She is the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, her only child that survived to adulthood. So she lives her Catholic faith, very Catholic. She goes down in history known as Bloody Mary. Protestants in her reign are burned at the stake. She married the Spanish Catholic Philip II and is drawn into a war with France. All of this made her very unpopular. But she died. Her reign is fairly short as well. She died without issue. And in her short reign, a bit under 300 Protestants were executed. So now in a short time, England has had a Protestant monarch, now a Catholic monarch, and then comes to power Elizabeth I. She rules England from 1558 to 1603. Over her reign, by the way, about 200 Catholics are executed for treason, not so much for just for what they believe, but for treason. And Elizabeth, the last Tudor monarch, is regarded as having a quite successful reign. And she was Protestant, but she was fairly moderate. She was very much a political individual in that she was looking for solutions and trying to keep her government running without tremendous fracture. And she was famous for taking the view that she did not wish to set a window into men's souls. So this is still a time when it was very much accepted that you had to believe a certain way or else you should be punished if you didn't believe what the Orthodox way was. And she wasn't, so we're not in a world where people say, well, just people should have freedom of religious liberty, like our country is founded, a belief our country is founded in, but we're not there yet. So in some ways it was, to editorialize kind of an advancement that let me pause and not go there. I mean, I just sort of said advancement. For her to have this very moderate take of saying she did not wish to set a window into men's souls. But then I have to stop myself because I remember that so many ancient empires and my empires as well, they weren't really ever interested in setting a window into anyone's soul. You do the rituals, you're good to go. And it was with the Inquisition that we're going to sit people down and question them about what is in their hearts and punish them if their inner beliefs don't match with what we think the theology is. At any rate, so there's Elizabeth I, and she, as I said, successful rule. England is going Protestant. Anglican becomes kind of the phrase. It's not all over yet. A couple years after her death, there's an attempt by Catholic terrorists to blow up Westminster is thwarted, and that is the root of Guy Fawkes Day, which is a holiday still celebrated in England with kind of joviality instead of the kind of horror of this thwarted terrorist attack. So that's really quickly the Reformation's early years in England. French wars of religion. France is also not spared. France is mostly a Catholic place. Protestants there are called Huguenots, and for several decades in the second half of the 16th century, they too have wars of religion, not fought constantly, but with various flare-ups. One of the most horrific flare-ups was St. Bartholomew's Day, which happened in 1572, and this was a horrific episode in which the Catholic state authorized a massacre of Protestants. Catherine de Medici was the regent to her son, King Henry II, and she is much implicated for convincing Henry to massacre Huguenots. That may not be the last word on that history, but at any rate, these are kind of details of that story that I won't pause on now. You can see this online if you want to look into it more. But the Pope had a medal struck celebrating the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, and later Henry of Navarre, he's Protestant, he's raised Protestant, he converts to Catholicism and reportedly, famously said, Paris is worth a mass. France would see considerably more religious violence before it was all over, and in 1598, the Edict of Nantes was issued, and this permitted Huguenots not only freedom of worship, but also the freedom to arm themselves and to build and maintain fortifications against possible outbreaks of anti-Protestant violence. That provision certainly being a recognition of the horror of St. Bartholomew's Day. For a while, and thus France was able for a while to contain peaceably both Protestant and Catholic communities. On this World War tour of Europe, what happened? What about the wars of religion in Spain? Well, they didn't really have them. And one interpretation to, I'm simplifying here, but we're kind of just doing this broad survey, is one interpretation is that the Spanish Inquisition, founded in 1478 as a royal inquisition, which gave it slightly different rules, that it was exceptionally harsh in the early 16th century, and that stamped out heresies and kind of stamped out the growth of a real Protestant movement in Spain. It's said that in the early 16th years of the 16th century, the execution rate for people condemned under the Inquisition stood at around 10%, whereas after 1540, those that were convicted or executions stood at just about 2.5%. At any rate, it is something to think about. Spain, for the most part, remains stalwartly Catholic for the time being. I do want to point out that even as in 1572, we have this massacre of Protestants by Catholics under Catholic rule in France, in Paris, that farther to the east in Warsaw, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, it's a very different story. In 1573, in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Sejm, which is the Polish parliament, they pass what's called the Warsaw Confederation Act. And this act guaranteed religious freedom to the szlachta, the Polish nobility, although there were lots of thousands of Polish nobility from very rich to very poor. And so it institutionalized a multi-confessional pluralism, which we shouldn't overstate. In 1595, there'll be a Union of Brest, which creates a uniate church that subordinated Orthodox subjects to the Pope in Rome, and Orthodoxy even actually became illegal and was so until 1632. So it's not a totally happy story. If you want to know more about that story, take my old Russia class with me in the spring, because we'll talk a lot more about it there. But nonetheless, this is, I would say, a happier situation than the religious wars that we're seeing roiling Western Europe during this time. So let me stop here and take up this big question. I know this is a long lecture. You're being very patient. Hang in there. How does the church respond? The Catholic Church responds with something that we call the Counter-Reformation. The Counter-Reformation was the Catholic Church's response to the Reformation. Now, more than in 1570, the Catholic Church outlawed indulgences. That, if you note the dates, is more than half a century after Luther published his 95 Theses, or distributed his 95 Theses. So it got there, but it took a while. More immediately, however, the Catholic Church, does it bend towards the complaints and the critiques of Protestant reformers? No. The church double downs on its belief. It found it, and it decides we just need to do a better, more aggressive job of teaching our faith. It founds the Society of Jesus, who are the Jesuits, and these are found. The earliest founder is Ignatius, the Spanish Ignatius Loyola, who founds the Jesuits. Their mission is to train clergy and to promote learning. Jesuits in China are kind of writing treatises that are foundational to the scientific revolution and increasing our understanding of the cosmos, of physics, etc. So Jesuits really play a major role in the promotion of learning. They found many colleges, but their first task is to teach the Catholic theology. And the Jesuits are quite a force. Now, the Catholic Church, and so they're founded in 1534, but that's not all that the Catholic Church does at all. The Catholic Church does recognize it needs reforms, and it reformed itself. And the Council of Trent are a series of meetings held from 1545 to 1563. And with these series of meetings, the Catholic Church reestablished its norms of belief and of behavior. It cleared up previously undefined areas. And in some, as I came down, it was very anti-Protestant. Does it lean towards saying, well, maybe these sacraments and the incest and the veneration and the richly painted icons, maybe they are kinds of smoke and mirrors and potpourri and not where salvation's at? Do they say that? No. They reaffirm their commitment to the power of the sacraments. And the Baroque isn't kind of an official church policy or anything, but in the late 16th, 17th century, we see the church really embracing the Baroque, a type of artwork that reaffirms emotion and mystery as a part of practicing one's faith. Here is a 17th century sculpture of the ecstasy of Saint Teresa, and you can kind of see this very the emotion is apparent even through stone. So Baroque is not any policy or one text or anything like that, but it's an aesthetic, a type of, it's a style, an emotional, elaborate style that is associated often with the Counter-Reformation. The church creates an index of forbidden books in 1564, making a list of books that were dangerous to Orthodox thinking and therefore banned. This was only really important now that there are so many books as a result of the new printing press. So, in consequence, what are some of the consequences of the Counter-Reformation? The Counter-Reformation made Catholic countries firm in their Catholicism, and it made it impossible or pretty hard for non-believers to live there. And secondly, it was it kind of was a clamp on kind of free expression and innovation. One thing that's said is that Catholic Spain in 14th, 15th centuries produces intellectuals and great artwork, et cetera, et cetera. But once the reassertion of strict Catholic belief and a kind of a fear of new ideas and heresy really takes hold, that you don't see the same vibrant, fruitful intellectual production from Spain. And many of many innovations will come from more pluralistic countries. Now, a key take-home point is that the Catholic Reformation is largely successful. Ultimately, many people opted for the mystery of Catholic practice over perhaps the cerebral sobriety that John Calvin promoted, although they both existed. And Steve Osment put it this way: whereas half of Europe could be counted in the Protestant camp in the mid 16th century, only 1/5 would be there by the mid 17th century. So we'll look at a couple of maps. This is 1555, a map sort of showing the religious divisions. And then a century later, we see the Catholic purple is spread much more solidly across Europe again. So the Protestant Reformation, it takes off, it's permanent, it has major consequences and is a sustained movement. But the Catholic Counter-Reformation does succeed in reasserting its hold over a great many people. Here's an even kind of simpler map showing you the same thing. If this is a kind of mid 16th century, you see yellow and orange and medium orange, all these different colors. And then later, we're going to have a more solidly Catholic part of Europe. Now, I want to turn, so that's an important key take-home point. Now I want to wrap up kind of thinking about the legacy of the Reformation with respect to tolerance and intolerance. The Reformation opens the door for, say, freedom of conscience and religious liberty. But in its moment, it was accompanied by and resulted in immediate intolerance. If you remember, John Calvin fled persecution in France, and Zwingli died in battle defending his religious beliefs. But both of these Christian men advocated executing those who believed differently than they thought one should believe. Thomas More, remembered as a martyr, who oversaw the execution of people who believed differently than he believed. And I can't resist here pausing to bring in another site of early modern intolerance. I'm just going to talk about witch trials, seemingly different from the Protestant Revolution. But witch trials. Here is a print representation of an early modern witch. Now, as the celebration of humanity's powers of rational thoughts gives rise to the scientific method and the scientific revolution, simultaneously we see witch persecutions across Europe. Between 1550 and 1650, there were between 100,000 and 200,000 witches, most often in Central and Western Europe, women that were executed as witches. So between 40 and 60,000 witches, people were executed as witches. Now, the Reformation did not cause witch trials. There is much overlap in the timing of these phenomena. Both Catholics and Protestants persecuted witches, so no one is exempt on that count. But there's two things I'd like to share about witch trials that are Reformation adjacent, we might say. Now, first, the role of the printing press seems to have had some role in how both of these phenomena played out. Here is a map of Incunabula. Incunable is a book that was printed before 1500. So if you thought that Schmalkaldic was your big word for the day, you can put Incunabula alongside of it. Books produced before 1501. At any rate, of these books, maybe 30,000 survive, and mapping them, this is about where they were. So this map sort of shows us places that had early on quite vibrant book industries. And this map right here in recent research by Leeson and Russ shows witchcraft prosecutions and litigation. So isn't that a bit ironic? One would think that with lots of books comes more learning. Well, what also, now first of all, correlation isn't causation. So that I can show you a map and saying, hey, look where there are bunches of books. Look, that's where there are also lots of witches. That doesn't seal the deal. that opens the door to questioning, right? That's an important kind of take-home point about historical method. And you hear this in other disciplines as well. Correlation isn't causation, but as historians trying to understand this phenomenon, it certainly raises flags and raises questions, and then start saying, hey, why is that? What's going on here? Well, here's one thing that might be going on there. Now, so you would think that with more books, more learning, more educated people, more prone to rational thinking and less inclined to believe in witches. Well, also, and this is a much more complicated story, but what, oh, and here is kind of that map sort of showing printing presses and witchcraft correlations alongside each other. You might say Northern Italy is an exception. Yes, yes. But up there in the Germanic countries and in the Low Countries, there does seem to be some correlations. What's also coming off the presses were frightening woodcuts such as these, vivid enough to terrify illiterate populations. And we've kind of been talking about that a little bit, you know, not, you didn't entirely need to read yourself in order to get some exposure to some of the things that's coming off printing presses, and illustrations can communicate directly with the illiterate. Now, a key point that I'd like to make about this is that living in an age where we are seeing the dark side of the internet and social media, you probably don't need me to spell this out for you, but I will. The printing press, this new communication technology, was as capable as disseminating false beliefs and misinformation, just as surely as it was disseminating true information. And in the case of witchcraft trials, indeed, some of those people executed were victims of a hysteria that was fomented by printed material. Now, a final point. The carnage of the witchcraft trials, according to this recent study by Leeson and Russ, suggests that the carnage seems to have been greatest where religious competition was most intense. That is, where Protestant churches and Catholic churches were vying for souls just blocks from each other. These were the areas that persecuted the most witches. Like an area that was totally Catholic, we don't see so many, and an area that was totally Protestant, not so much. But the most witchcraft persecution, according to Lisa and Russ's recent work, happened in these really polarized areas. And these were very polarized times. So witches, who were typically women, and marginalized women at that, older women who didn't have someone to protect them, were the ones that often paid the ultimate price for this intense competition in their midst. So yet, even as it resulted in intolerance, and here's one sort of the work that this is from the 2017 work by Leeson and Russ, that one graph from their work on witch trials in the Economic Journal that kind of shows trials, and we see Germany, Switzerland, these are Luxembourg, these are areas where the Reformation rages strongly. Down here we see timelines. So with the immediate Reformation, doesn't quite take off, but as the Counter-Reformation is in force with the spreading Protestant faiths, this is where we see witchcraft executions really take off. And my final point, even as it resulted in intolerance, the Reformation does open the door for religious and political pluralism. And this pluralism lays the path for, although it was through a path of bloody battlefields, make no mistake, it does lay the path for that hallowed principle on which the United States of America is founded, and that is the separation of church and state. That's all for now. Thank you.